All right, welcome back to the latest episode of Building Software Better. We have an amazing guest today, talk a little bit about technical leadership. Patrick, do you go by Pat or Patrick? I always like to ask that.
Yeah, either one's fine for me. So Pat's probably easier and shorter. So
Okay, so my full name is Jeffrey. I go by Jeff. I've always been called Jeff. The only person in the whole wide world that has called me Jeffrey was my mother, and I've always did not like it. So I go by Jeff, and that's my name. But we'll call you Pat. But it sounds like you're not so bothered like I am. I have mommy issues, I guess. So
appreciate
um,
you asking.
yeah, so look, we've got a fun conversation we're going to have about technical leadership, and you're kind of an authority around technical leadership, and you've got a phenomenal back. I'm going to let you tell it, but just a couple of highlights. You before kind of getting off and doing your own thing now, which you're going to tell us a bunch about. You were the CTO, chief scientist at N26, which I believe that's a European banking kind of financial services firm, right?
That's correct.
And that was about a year ago you left to kind of start off on your new endeavors. So we're going to let you tell us about that. And before that, you were principal consultant, technical leader at ThoughtWorks, which is a well regarded company in the technical space. So tell us a little bit about technical leadership and what it takes to be a great technical leader.
Yeah, so I guess I've been passionate about this topic about technical leadership for almost a decade. I started getting into this when I was at ThoughtWorks, obviously as a first-time technical leader, and I sort of struggled to find support, basically, right? So as a software engineer, you're sort of thrown into leading a technical team, and the way that most people sort of learn is by sort of watching others and trial and sort of error. But obviously, I think we can do a lot better at this as a sort of industry, which is one of the reasons why I've sort of gone down the path of studying and helping other people in their technical leadership journey. At the heart of it for me, technical leadership is really about a person who is responsible for sort of herding a group of people who are working together on a similar system or a product and making sure that there's alignment from that from a technical leadership perspective. Sometimes those people might have sort of formal people or line management, and that you might call them an engineering manager. In some places, you might be more of a person who has to sort of lead with influence, maybe as a tech lead or an architect. And of course, you see technical leadership at many different levels of an organization. You can think about the CTO setting the technical direction for the entire company, where the platform is going to evolve over a lot of time, all the way down into the technical leadership for a specific team working around a particular system and area. And so whenever you have a whole bunch of people who get together, you kind of need technical leadership.
Yeah. It seems to be a common theme we keep running into in a lot of our conversations where you sort of two things that sort of stuck out that you talked about that we seem to hear kind of repeatedly. One is that engineering transition from engineer, single individual contributor engineer into technical leadership seems to be more often than not sort of a battlefield promotion, sort of foisted upon you. So I think you sort of use those words. The second common theme seems to be, and maybe something you can help us with, is sort of this notion of companies don't really have formal training, right? It's sort of this battlefield promotion. Congratulations, you're now a people manager, and all the sort of complexities and complications that come along with that. Can you tell us a little bit about, one is like, is that sort of, do you think that's pretty commonplace? And then two, like, what do we do about that?
Yeah, it's super commonplace. And, I'm a big systems thinker, and I think there's a couple of different elements that contribute to the system. So, I think when I think about people who step in or who are promoted perhaps into their first technical leadership role, often they're the people who have very strong technical sort of skills and expertise. So, product people see them as the expert, or people on the team go to them because they know that they can answer questions the best or the quickest. But unfortunately, when you're in a technical leadership position, they're not the only skills you need to have in order to be successful. And this is the big trap that a lot of people fall into, is that people are sort of picked for one set of skills, but actually to be an effective technical leader, you need to have a sort of broad range of skills that you may or may not have developed. So some technical leaders may have had maybe experience leading a team, perhaps in a community club or in sort of external activities, but there are other technical leaders who literally it's their first time, and there's that thing about, I don't know what I should actually be doing. And unfortunately, a lot of organizations kind of assume that when they promote somebody into that role, they know what they're doing, and that's not the case. So, I often talk about this transition not necessarily being a promotion, but actually a sidestep into a very completely different role where you need to have very different skills. Now, some people may have built up some skills and experience in that, but often a lot of the things that made you a really good engineer don't make you a really great technical leader. Right. So when we're talking about things like communication, understanding people, navigating conflict, influencing not through authority or your expertise, but by building respect and by listening to people, these are not always skills that the best engineers have developed, which makes them perhaps the sort of weaker technical leader. A lot of companies don't also help themselves because they're not providing a lot of that sort of support to those people because they don't recognize this sort of skill gap. And so this is the system that sort of leads to a lot of this situation.
Yeah, and do you find that most companies don't have formal sort of technical leadership, sort of training and education and sort of a roadmap on how you develop, even before an engineer becomes a technical leader? Like I find that from my perspective that there's no back in the days, GE, General Electric was sort of renowned for like developing some of the best CEOs in the industry. I don't know if that's the case anymore, but for a long time, they had really specific, IBM as well, very specific management tracks that you got on, but way before you became a manager, right? To teach you actually how to become a manager, how to manage people, how to, all the things you talked about. It seems like we've sort of gotten away from that, certainly in technical roles. Maybe that exists in other roles I'm not familiar with, but it seems like for technical roles, like you said, you go from being the smart person, the person maybe that's been there, it's got all the knowledge, and then congratulations, you're now running a team. And all the really hard parts, sort of the easy parts of, technical leadership is you sort of become an expert, domain expert in your, sort of craft or field or product. Become, like you said, those are the hard things, and sort of people management has nothing to do with like technical at all. It's persuasion, it's empathy, it's sort of servant leadership. It's all these sort of things that are not natural. They're not naturally born. You're not naturally born with these things. You have to be sort of taught and led and sort of mentored. And most companies don't seem to like put any stock into that. And sort of the single biggest contributing factor when people leave is the sort of that quit is people don't quit companies, they quit leaders, right? They quit, their managers. So how do you think about sort of, if we look out 10 years from now, like how should the industry, specifically maybe the more technically oriented roles and engineering type things, how should we change, if you will, to get better?
Yeah, so I think, one of the interesting things that you asked before is that, is this a common thing in a lot of companies? And unfortunately, it's not. I think there are some companies that at least do provide some general management or leadership training. So if you have a strong people or HR team, there'll generally be support for that. But one of the traps with that is you'll generally be put into a cohort with other leaders and managers, which is great because you'll be tackling sort of more perhaps generic sort of skills like learning how to listen, learning how to coach, how to give effective feedback. But then sometimes it's very hard to translate that into the specific situations you'll find yourself as a technical leader. There's also a gap that technical leaders have in particular, which won't be covered by the more general sort of people leadership management training. And this is really to do with technical leadership. So, how do you manage quality issues when you are growing a team really rapidly? How do you actually manage your software architecture and manage the technical risks for the system that you're actually building? How do you influence your product managers to convince them, we need to redesign or re-architect something because, we're reaching breaking point for a particular area of the system that we have. So there's a whole bunch of other sort of technical leadership topics that are sort of expected of you in that sort of technical lead role that you won't normally have experience as an engineer because your tech lead has normally taken care of it, but nobody will teach you how to actually do that. And so that's kind of something that I hope more companies can actually sort of address. And I am starting to see some promises with this, because you see this in perhaps the larger, more established tech companies. Think about the Googles or the Facebooks, where they do have decades of growing many people at many levels. And they also have a benefit of having a bigger community of people. So, you start to see some programs put together because their people team start to work with other senior engineering leaders to start thinking about succession planning. Right. And so some of this might be more about tools of duty, which is, something that GE was kind of famous for, about letting people see how other people approach that role and getting an understanding about the types of tasks that they might actually have. One of the things that I'm offering, for instance, is a workshop dedicated to focusing on the skills that people need to have when they fall into this role. It's a sort of accelerant, but it's also not necessarily a replacement for, when people are on the job, making sure they also have the opportunities to sort of fail safely, to do something that they've never done before, but then have that support network around them. And so that's another sort of aspect that I'm starting to see a lot of other companies have, which is not only just having training and not only just having a sort of tour of duty, but also building a community of people, of those people who are growing, and then also those people who can help support the next generation by sharing and mentoring them on their particular journey.
Yeah, that's great. And sort of next question I was going to ask you, sort of bring it up. I mean, what's the sort of difference between a large company, let's use the Googles and Facebooks of the world, and the smaller, maybe emerging startups, maybe not yet Google, but certainly fast growing, high tech, high growth type companies. What's sort of the difference in sort of size of organization and velocity of organization, and how does this sort of change?
Oh, this is a whole topic of itself, I think. But, I think there's definitely something about the size of it, right? So I think with Google or Facebook, when you're talking about, I don't even know how many engineers they have, tens of thousands of people, there's a lot of sort of coordination and ways to structure that sort of organization. The downside to something like that, obviously, is that you need to have processes, and sometimes those processes feel for an individual engineer maybe slow and tedious, right? So it's kind of like the process of the lowest common denominator, or something that everyone can sort of get by, but it might feel constraining for some other people. If you're working in, say, a startup, for instance, where you don't really have these sort of policies or process, it might feel like you have a lot more sort of freedom, but the trade-off there is that you maybe are doing things differently across your organization, which can also contribute to confusion or conflict around that. One of the other differences you tend to get between sort of the difference of size is, when you're a Google or a Facebook sort of scale, you have people that have perhaps been there before. So when you are earlier in your own sort of technical leadership journey, you probably can cast out, messages on messaging apps or an email to a particular group to ask, hey, has somebody done this before? Who can I talk to that can help me go through this place? And you can learn from others from that perspective. When you're in a sort of smaller company, you have to start searching for external groups or networks, and you may not be able to actually tap into that expertise. And if you do, they're often, have done that experience in a very different context. So they don't necessarily understand your company culture. So these are trade-offs and differences.
Yeah, that's right. I found that a lot. I mean, it's sort of like, the proverbial, answer every senior architect gives you or a senior engineer gives you, it depends, right? I mean, it's sort of like, this is sort of the problem as you get out of context and as you try to get mentors of people. I do a number of people that I mentor. And I was on the phone with someone on Friday, and we were talking about fundraising and some stuff around that. And, most of my answers were, well, here's 3 or 4 options, but it depends. It sort of depends on sort of like things that I don't know or understand that I can't answer for you, versus when you're inside of the situation, to your point, it's a lot easier to say, well, here's kind of what we specifically done in the past in this very specific situation. I kind of understand your context, understand what we're trying to do. And that sort of adds a much deeper level of empathy and understanding and sort of help. But you don't always get that choice as a startup, right? I mean, I'm helping another startup tomorrow work through an architectural issue. To your point, they're having to sort of come to me outside of their company to get some expertise. But again, it's sort of like, well, I'm going to have to like get up to speed on sort of all the considerations to be able to give you good advice.
Absolutely.
The technical challenge, right? So how does, sort of how does methodology sort of come into this? Do you have a methodology that you teach or that you recommend? Or is it sort of like it depends, the proverbial, it sort of depends on the situation and the size, et cetera?
No, so I don't really have a methodology as such, but I do have a number of sort of principles that I use, and I try to help people think about that. So, for instance, when you're stepping into a sort of technical leadership role for the first time, a lot of first-time people will be stuck in what I call as maker mode, right? So, your individual contributor, I want to create everything, I want to have ownership, I want to make all the tough decisions myself. That's very much maker mode, and one of the challenges for a lot of people is transitioning to what I describe as multiplier mode, which is sort of being able to trust that you're also surrounded by other intelligent, bright makers who will learn. And now your role is quite different of, you're not necessarily going to be the person that will always make that call or have that decision. In fact, it's better if you give that ownership to other people because they'll, have full responsibility. They'll have opportunities to grow and learn. But if you're stuck in that maker mode, it's very hard to then give that away to other sort of people. So that, for instance, I wouldn't describe as a methodology, but definitely that sort of mental mindset shift is a really key point to doing that. And there's a lot of things that I try to teach people in terms of specific, how to manage their time, how to sort of delegate things that will help them with that maker to multiplier mindset shift.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I always call it amplification, but same sort of concept. Is like how do you sort of amplify your resources and help them really, get more. One plus one is two, but how do you sort of make it one, one to the square of two or three, not, sort of that. So how do sort of talk to us about, okay, I'm an engineer. I'm in this mode. I don't have a lot of support resources. Maybe I'm in a fast-growing startup, and we don't have sort of the Google formal, training programs and support systems, and sort of help me, in my career development. Like, what advice would you give me as I'm a senior engineer. I've got a lot of the technical leadership capabilities from a technical standpoint, not a people and operations standpoint. What would be your recommendation?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that I would normally recommend. So one of them is if you're a senior engineer, you've probably got other existing tech leads, or maybe one or two in your organization, depending on how big it is. And so, a really good opportunity is starting to sort of shadow those people and to sort of ask for more responsibility. So it's a win-win because hopefully those tech leads or other technical leaders will be relieved that somebody wants to maybe take more work off their plate because often people will be overwhelmed. But it also starts to give you an insight into maybe what their world is like without being held sort of accountable. And, if you fail, you have somebody that you can go back to that can give you support about how to go about doing something. If you don't have access or the opportunity to take on more responsibility, I would then suggest reaching out to other people, so people in your community or people in your network, to sort of talk to them about, sort of learning through other people who are in that role in different companies. The sort of third bit of advice is, we've done a lot better as an industry at writing up and sharing a lot more information around this. So, I'm a big advocate for the Lead Dev sort of conference and the YouTube videos that they've produced. There's a lot of other sort of, I believe there's a Silicon Valley engineering technical leadership meetup group that is now doing online events. So there's a lot of other sort of information out there. I published a book 2014 about talking with tech leads. So, by looking for some of this information, you can start to understand the types of skills that you probably need to start building, and then start to put yourself into opportunities where you can start practicing and developing those skills.
Yeah, that's great. And we'll put this in the sort of the end of your blog, but I think you just posted a blog recently, a few days ago, about sort of different communities of sort of technical leadership. So make sure people kind of check out that resource that you shared. So okay, so now let's say I am. I always like to say sort of like good people and sort of operational management is very intention oriented, right? It doesn't just sort of show up. So, we're in this we're still in the middle of this pandemic. January 2021, remote work has sort of come on the scene. I always like to say it's not necessarily remote work. It's like work at home, maybe for a lot of people, which is a little bit different than remote work. Yeah, exactly. So, and sort of maybe doesn't come with some of the maybe typical remote work sort of benefits where you can sort of work in lots of different places and sort of get out of the house or get out of wherever you sort of, sort of work from. But, I'm a technical leader. And maybe I'm a seasoned sort of technical leader, but like this world is different. Like a lot of things, there's stress, there's, sort of everything going on in the world right now. Like what is sort of your advice for me, especially I always like to say sort of walking around management where, we were all my team was physically located and, like Google, lots of companies really promoted this idea of the sort of cohesion. Everybody was in the same place, specialized workplaces for the sort of the collaboration they were doing, things like that. That doesn't exist anymore, right? We're sort of, at least not for a while maybe, and for most companies, what's sort of advice for me to like, how do I manage my team? How do I think about all the sort of change that's happening? And how do I maybe even do it differently than I've sort of been brought up and learned, over the years?
Yeah, so I think you touched upon a really great point here, which is like the current situation is not necessarily the same as a normal remote working sort of environment. And so I want to touch upon that first. So, I think given the state of many different things that you hear about in the news, I think one of the first things you have to take care of, even as a seasoned engineering leader, is to take care of your sort of mental health. Right. So there are some people that I'm sort of coaching and working with where they have family, they have to worry about childcare. There's all of these distractions, that are affecting their ability to sort of focus. And I kind of like to use the airplane, even though it's not great to fly, but that same sort of metaphor is you have to take care of your breathing mask first before you can help other people. Right. And so if you're not in a great place with your sort of mental health, it's going to be very hard to help your team. So, taking regular breaks, making sure that you have the time focused for you so that you're comfortable, that you're on top of all your biggest sort of priorities and the risks, and you sort of are in a sort of good place. So make sure that you have that time first, that you have your space, that you feel in a sort of good place, and then sort of start to focus on your sort of team. Now, I think for a lot of people who've been sort of forced into this area, there's a lot of people who've never even met their team for the first time, right? There's people who are hiring their team. And so, and in these sorts of situations, we used to be able to rely on that sort of in-person sort of meeting, the spending time at lunch times. So this is something that you have to kind of almost spend more time focusing on, of building those relationships. And unfortunately, building personal relationships is just a lot harder in a remote context, right? So there's just so much more that we can't share, shared experiences, sort of shared jokes, but you have to be a little bit more deliberate in sort of investing in that. And so similarly, investing in those personal relationships and investing in sort of building that team and creating those sort of serendipitous moments to sort of connect people to. And I think what's hard in this is sort of if you've been working in this sort of world for a while, you probably get used to it. But if you've been co-located and you have to shift, you also have to shift those habits, right? So it's about sort of resetting ground rules for people. So, some teams have moved from like in-person stand-ups to having just stand-ups in a Slack channel, because asynchronous communication is a lot easier than having a meeting. People are, a good upside to this is Zoom exhaustion. People are actually questioning, do we really need to meet? Are there alternative ways of, maybe writing a design document and adding comments to that instead before we actually agree on meeting to come up with that decision? So sort of challenging your normal working assumptions.
Yeah, we've definitely done that. We've sort of tried to reset everything and just sort of have to rethink everything sort of from the ground up. To your point, I mean, do we really need all these meetings? We've pretty much got rid of all of our meetings for the most part. We obviously collaborate, in our product, but I mean, we collaborate in sort of the shared sort of live collaborative document space we call, sort of workspace. Obviously Slack as well. So for all your other sort of asynchronous type communication. It's been very freeing because I think we can get a lot more deep work done. We basically have a 9 o'clock, sort of stand-ups, which are not allowed to last more than an hour. They typically last less than 30 minutes. They are on video, although almost now nobody even turns the video on anymore. It's just more for audio. And it's good to kind of hear people's voice sometimes. But then after that, you're allowed to have sort of a meeting if you need to right after that, sort of immediately after that, if you need to peel off and do, sort of some deeper dive into something with a smaller group. But outside of that, no meetings for the rest of the day. They need to sort of be intentionally scheduled conversations we'll have tomorrow so that we can all be involved for the people that need to be involved. Otherwise, like you said, we do a lot more documentation. in collaboration that way, a little bit more asynchronous. And it's been harder, but it's been also more liberating in some ways, right? I feel like we've been able to get a lot more deeper work when someone sort of goes offline for 3 hours and just sort of deep works on something engineering. I'm talking obviously technical here. It seems like the progress and sort of their sort of ability to sort of do better stuff, if you will, and faster is much better than all the like asynchronous interruptions that you have all throughout the day, which are so difficult. Now, what I do miss, and you use a word that I use a lot, is serendipitous. I do seem to, it's hard to sort of have, sort of antithetical to have a serendipitous, intentional serendipity, right? That doesn't mean anything, right? So, like, how do you have, these sort of moments that are, if you will, around the proverbial water cooler, or just taking someone out to lunch? And we're not talking specifically about work. I feel like in some ways, a lot of things have become more transactional as around work, meaning, everything is very much work, and some of the things about getting to know people and just having a chat and learning a little bit about things that you might do when you're just talking or just going out to lunch or we're sitting at the water cooler having a snack or something. You seem to miss some of that a little bit. I mean, how do you sort of capture that again? It can.
Yeah, I think, yeah, absolutely. So I think you can. It's going to be different though. So, I think one of the things, like if you're using something like Slack, is, it's very cheap to create a new channel. And, I think the thing that is really nice about something like this is that people can create channels around different types of interests. And so I think that's a nice way of creating some serendipitous connections of, what are interests that span, people, if it's about sort of sport or hobby, there's one Slack that I'm part of where people post updates to what they're cooking for the day because they're passionate about food. And, some of that sort of brings back some of that sort of humanity and that sort of serendipity of like, oh yeah, I know that person through that Slack channel, even though I may not have met them in real life. Other teams that I've talked to, some people actually set up intentional sort of team sort of bonding things where, you have to be a bit careful because not everyone necessarily drinks. But I know of like one team, for instance, where they sent out sort of the same sort of tea sample sort of kit to everyone. And the goal was for everyone to sort of brew it at the same time and then to sort of comment as a way of doing some mutual sort of team bonding. And so this is where, as a leader and manager, you have to be a little bit more deliberate, particularly around that team side, around sort of crafting those experiences where people can sort of get together. Other people, they have fun building their own Animal Crossing sort of islands and sharing that with each other to show like a little bit more about themselves.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, we have a couple of channels in our Slack. Obviously, the default random channel, so people post all kinds of random funny things in there. And then we have a family channel, and people post pictures of like all their kids and like fun things. We had a snow, really weird in Austin to get snow, but we had a big snowfall a couple days ago, and just seeing all the kids out in the snow and just, back to, like you said, it brings a whole, look, you spend, more than a third of your life, with these types of people and work. It's like you want to sort of get to know them. You don't necessarily need to be best friends with everyone, but certainly, you want to get to know the people you're working with. And like I said, it brings a lot of humility, a lot of empathy to the workplace, which I think is often missing, especially in these types of like very transactional oriented environments versus relational. I like to say I want to be more relational environment versus a transactional environment. It's okay to just talk to talk, like that's totally
Absolutely.
fine. Like that's part of like being a human and getting to know people and enjoying the people you work with. We don't always have to talk because we need to talk about a very specific subject on some issue that we need to talk through.
Exactly. And I think as a leader manager, showing or leading by example is a really great way. So if you're taking part in these channels, it sort of indicates that, it's not a waste of time. This is, sort of value. Obviously, you have to watch out how much time you spend and, you don't want people just doing that, but you do want to bring a bit of humanity into this world where we're so disconnected from each other.
Yeah. And I always say, like, look, if the people are working for you, you have to trust them, sort of holistically. Ultimately, you're going to trust that people are going to always do the right things. And if you don't, if you get to that point where you don't, you probably, either something's got to change or maybe they shouldn't be there. And so, okay, to wrap us up, okay, now I'm a technical, senior technical leader, a CEO, CTO, head of engineering of a larger company. I've listened to everything you've said. This is super interesting. I need help though. I can't do this by myself, and I certainly can't do it with just waiting on HR to kind of do that, fill that gap for me. I really want to take control of my own organization's destiny, and I want to be intentional about it. How can you help me?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think one of the things that I can run is a sort of workshop for your company. And one of the great things about bringing people in your own company together is, like we were talking about before, they have a shared context. They know what that sort of problem is. I think sometimes it's also worthwhile developing your own sort of technical leadership path, right? So if you have a VP engineering, or if you have a sort of senior engineering manager, they can also work together to sort of bring those same sort of people together on a regular basis. So you can sort of end up sort of co-coaching and creating this community around that as well. So there'd be two different recommendations I would have for you.
And how does that work today with sort of in the sort of COVID world? Is this virtual? Can you do it virtual?
Yeah, I do
Does
a
it work?
online remote workshop. Before COVID, I used to do a 2-day in-person one, but
Okay.
obviously with COVID, it's now a 4-hour sort of a single session. So it's self-contained where you can sort of complete things. 4 hours is kind of the max before people sort of start to fizzle out energy-wise. And it's interactive, so there's exercises where people have to interact and have breakout rooms, discussions. There's a Miro whiteboard where there's activities that people can interact with. Yeah, so it's
And
all
so
online
just a little
optimized.
bit of Zoom fatigue, just not too much Zoom fatigue, but just a couple of days of Zoom fatigue.
A good one.
Yeah, good one, good one. Okay, well, where do we find you at? I mean, where do you live on the internet?
Yeah, you can find me at Pat Kua, and it's kua.com. And you can also subscribe to my newsletter, which is there, levelup.patkua.com. And that website also has all of the information about me on Twitter, same handle there. And the details for the workshop are available there as well.
All right. Well, thank you. It's been an awesome conversation, Pat. You're very well qualified to have this conversation, and we appreciate your insights. And for all those listeners out there, thank you for joining. Join us at buildsoftwarebetter.org.
Thanks very
And we
much.
look forward to talking to you soon.